rivers were like about to flood, but they weren't. So we're just checking the pond, and
how's it going, everyone? So we are getting potentially a really big storm. I'm psyched. I feel bad for people in the floodplain, but it's good we're getting, it's good. It's a very wet summer. So gardens are coming along nicely. It's been just a beautiful, like super wet, like legit old school wet summer. Really, really psyched about it. But now they're predicting like 4 to 7 inches in the next 36 hours. And things are already flowing pretty good. This pond is overflowing about a gallon a minute, with no storm, before the storm is really even coming in. That's what it's yielding. And so what I'm going to do here, this is a cool thing you can do if you have an adjustable outflows. I'm going to walk into the pond here, and I'm actually going to drop the level before the big plug of water comes in, which is predicted to be tonight. And we can basically create the ability to shock absorb more by dropping the pond down ahead of a major plug of water coming into the system. So these are called Holzer monks. I don't know that Sepp Holzer invented it, but some people in the permaculture space call them Holzer monks. And this is 4-inch drain pipe, sewer and drain, C&D, I think they call it. Schedule like 60.
Now I'm removing the riser on our largest pond to create more shock absorbing capacity there.
That's
Went
awesome.
really well.
Totally going. Woohoo!
So this can drop about 2,000 gallons a minute, which just in a few hours gives us about 500,000 gallons of extra storage capacity.
So here's the next day, and this 2-acre pond has come up. I don't know if I showed this yesterday, but that rock there out in the middle was about 18 inches more exposed than it is now. 16 inches. So it's come up that. Well, that was when I started dropping the water. So I probably dropped another 5 inches since I left, before the rain really started. So say it's come up at least about 20 inches. That's a lot of water. That has activated the Overflow Spillway where I'm standing right now. So the Overflow Spillway is going. It's just starting. Barely running, which is great. These pipes here are maxed out. They're underwater now. 3 4-inch pipes. Overflow Spillway, it's not even actually starting. It's just creeping up to here. So it's, just about to start. So we're doing pretty good. That Overflow Spillway is 10 feet wide and will take a full foot of depth before we risk water coming over the berm, which is the whole point to avoid. So doing well. Water's high. We've gotten 3 inches in since it started raining last night. you know, that's not that much water, really, compared to what can happen. So it's nothing to be, you know, ridiculously proud of. But you got to be ready for stuff like this. You know, I'd like to be ready for twice as much water as this in the same amount of time. Oh wow, the whatchamacallit, the pallet is floated off. So the incoming water is exceeding what this 18-inch by 18-inch vertical standpipe can remove by a lot. It's also filled with crap from a beaver, which has never quite cleared itself out, and I haven't figured out how to get out because it's like 14 feet vertical with shit in it, sticks and mud. But that's why we have overflow spillways. I just came back here to the overflow spillway. It's 5 minutes, not even, and it's now there's gallons a minute coming over it. So the water is rising. So now the thing to do is watch the overflows, make sure debris doesn't clog them. But once a storm comes, there's really not so much you can do. You gotta do everything beforehand. You can see the profile here. Drops down flat and then rises up there. So it's like a trapezoid shaped, flat bottomed. Sod is the material of choice you want in here. This should be mowed more than I have been. You want just a dense sod. You don't really want any woodies taking root in this area. So here's the garden pond. Next morning, overflow spillway, 100% going, flowing nicely. This is never activated. This is a pond I built 2 years ago, and so this has never flowed before. So it's nice to see it. Again, probably should have weed whacked in here, scythed, just if for nothing else, just to be able to keep track of where the water's going, make sure there's no clogs in there, you know, really be able to see everything. Wow, so there's dozens of gallons a minute of water leaving this pond. See, there's a little rut in here, so that ideally wouldn't be the case, and water would get from here over more easily. You can see, and now knocking down this rut now isn't a good idea because I'll start creating a head cut of erosion right there as this water rushes off into there. So again, the time to be ready for all this is before the storm. I mean, you can clear clogs and stuff during the storm potentially, but your back's really against the wall once the plug of water is coming off the mountains. So yeah, nice to see everything activated. I may want to lower that overflow spillway a tiny bit, which I would only do in a really long dry stretch so I could get the seed established. As you can see, that's a pretty, not a super conservative overflow spillway. The water of the pond itself is right here, so that's pond water level. That's only a couple inches, of rise that could happen before it's coming over the berm here. And we can see that spillway is moving, but it's only going to move so much water. I could widen it, could raise the berm a little, but that's a lot of material movement. So probably I might lower that just a little bit, even by hand. Just get some more volume that can move through it, especially on the left side there where I think it's just kind of getting hung up a little bit. So it's nice. It's always really nice to see these things go, so you really learn how they are. But obviously once that's happening, stuff's pretty real. You see there's pond level right there, so there's not a ton of room on the berm here. I'm not concerned because look at this vegetation here. If water were to overtop the berm here, you know, I don't think we're going to see a lot of erosion happen. All of a sudden, that's so much volume that you can handle in a laminar flow. Just you're not going to tend to get channelization as long as it's a very smooth berm. And if everything's really well vegetated on the backside where a head cut of erosion would start cutting in, you should be fine. But you don't want that to happen. You know, that's what these structures are trying to prevent. I also have a bit of a secondary overflow right here. I could actually carve that. So right in here, which is also another good place for an overflow between original grade and fill. This pond has 3 of them because it's essentially 2 berms, because the grade comes down the original grade there. So there's like a berm, original grade, and then a berm, and then original grade, all the way to right about here. So I could take this boundary between original grade and fill and lower that, just scrape it a little, so then we'd have a secondary overflow spillway that would also activate at the same time and come right through here and get out to our outflow structure, which goes to the creek. It is wet right now. It's amazing. This pond is about 4 inches higher than I normally maintain it. Amazing to see all these structures at beyond capacity. Well, some are beyond capacity, and the main ones are at capacity or just under. Never seen this amount of water, and this pond's only 2 years old, so it's been a dry 2 years. But it's great to have this water in the high summer, you know, so much better than having this in March when nothing's really utilizing it for growth. Here's the creek we built with the WSD apprentices 2 years ago. Looking really good. Step pools could be bigger to buffer this energy coming down in. But, you know, having everything vegetated is just where it's at. We could lose this bridge here into the pond, and another inch of water. But well, it's starting to rain again pretty hard. So let's see. Nice little event, big event. Probably the biggest generalized rainstorm in this part of New England since Hurricane Irene, when stuff got really real. Haven't seen this overflow spillway activated in years. And one thing that I'm learning right now, well, just reminding myself, is it's good to keep this mode. Just this amount of material in here slows the flow enough that you're losing capacity of water movement. I mowed my other spillway up above yesterday, but I didn't come down here with the mower. And usually I've mowed this berm now once or twice. It's just been so wet. I haven't wanted to drive around with the tractor. But a good little learning piece. Road's holding up good so far. Not as much of a crown as there should be there in the middle. You can see where people drive, but the water bars are doing their thing. I hope everyone's doing well. Our wood chip driveway took a little hit in the very strong downpour a couple weeks ago, but as long as we don't drive on it much right now, it's okay. This new little water bar is doing great, keeping a lot of water off of it. Sending it to the J-chokes. Being a landscape where bedrock is rarely more than a few inches to, or a foot or two below the surface, water moves pretty quickly once it starts raining real hard. So the importance of
catching it, slowing it, spreading it, and sinking it is even more important in these places than it would be in, it is in places with deep soils that can serve as that storage and buffer to sink the stormwater into the ground and have it end up in the rivers days or weeks or even months later versus minutes or hours later. So this these two ponds down here, it's a 2-acre large pond, and then there's about a ½ acre pond here. They're about 3 million gallons of storage total. The bottom one I dropped about 12 inches before the storm came. That gave us about 500,000 gallons of storage and shock absorption capacity. This one I didn't drop at all, one we call the barn pond, wild rice pond. I don't have the infrastructure in place, large pipes to really drop it quickly. But that's okay because all the water that leaves the barn pond ends up in the big pond. This pond here has no clay and tends to drop in the dry season, which it was quite far down before this storm. And it only filled about halfway through the storm. So this feature was absorbing all stormwater from the 10 plus acres of woods which feed into it. As you can see, that water coming out of the woods right now, many gallons a minute. There's another little flow over here. There's probably at least 10 gallons a minute coming out of the woods still. And then that water is distributed out here to this swale and goes along that swale 400 feet out to a ridge, and it's percolating in the ground the whole time. And it will end up, when it's very wet, in that big pond. But it'll end up there hours, if not some days later, not joining the huge wall of water that's flooding the valley below. We're about 1,000 feet above the valley where floods are happening now. Not too bad in our area with this storm event, but really bad in some places. Floodplains flood. That's what they do. So I'm gonna go out in these swales and just check out, see the water flow out there. It's so great to see. I love these big storm events because they're really good for our farm. I feel bad for people who are in the floodplains because they flood and that causes problems. It's too bad that once the industrial layer of human settlement came to this place, we started making the land use pattern became catastrophic because we started putting all our infrastructure in floodplains. And but it's too bad because it's unnecessary. These storms can just be a good thing for the land. They're dropping millions of pounds of nitrogen onto the state, fertilizing the ground, growing plants like crazy, and recharging groundwater, and doing so much good for the state as a whole. And here's just a nice little example of just lots of little ways to, you don't have to dig to infiltrate slow spread sink water. Here's a tree that came down, and I just pushed it horizontally so it intercepts this water flow. And there's basically like a minor swale right here, just with debris, with some rocks and some woody debris. And, a lot of water gets past that, but in a big flow of water, that just causes a little bit of ponding, as you can see right here, and there's infiltration happening there. So in that area, there's water now dropping into the ground in this area. Now it's hitting bedrock for sure, but it's in the soil sponge, so it's moving more slowly. I say slow it, spread it, sink it, and that slow it is a key piece. Head into the field, see what's shaking out here. Here's our feral Icelandic chickens that
just won't stay wherever we want them. So we just let them hang out with the cows. They're making a living. So here's a storage that, as far as I can tell, only filled up towards the end of the storm. So basically almost 5 inches of rain on the 5 acres that feed into this pond that are in this watershed was completely absorbed. None of it got near the river during the flood event. It was all kept on the hills because it's a nice sized pond, and it was quite far down before the storm came in. So the whole length of travel in that shock, if you think of it as a shock on the front of a mountain bike, basically the travel was enough to almost completely absorb the half foot of rain we got. So here's a storage that, as far as I can tell, only filled up towards the end of the storm. So basically almost 5 inches of rain on the 5 acres that feed into this pond that are in this watershed was completely absorbed. None of it got near the river during the flood event. It was all kept on the hills because it's a nice sized pond, and it was quite far down before the storm came in. So the whole length of travel in that shock, if you think of it as a shock on the front of a mountain bike, basically the travel was enough to almost completely absorb. So it was the first time in about almost 10 years that we're percolating on the ridge. There's been enough water that the valleys where the ponds are have pumped out enough water during the growing season to completely fill our main swale in the middle of the field and bring water all the way out to this ridge right here, which is just bedrock, super dry. And we're actually sending water, sheeting water across this ridge right now. There's dozens of gallons a minute just flowing smoothly with no erosion, and dropping and flowing and dropping, hitting other swales before it makes it into that big pond down below, which from there it will make it into the local brook and end up in the main watershed. So really neat to see that kind of shock absorption happening. You know, these infrastructure systems are sometimes they're not used for years at a clip, and you see that's all that water. But when you need them, you really want them. It's an emergency measure to some extent, but somewhat necessary if you want to do well in these big events, and certainly helps reduce flooding in the watershed below. So really the benefit of these is almost more for people below us in the floodplain, more than it is for us. Although this is a major fertility benefit for us to keep most of this water on site in the ground with its nitrogen and other benefits versus just shunt it down into the river floodplain below. So when it's all said and done, most of Vermont got at least a couple inches, and as predicted, the spine of the greens got 4 to 7. Some places got 8+. We got about 5.5 total here on our 2 sites, and it was very well predicted storm. We knew what was coming for really days. Here's putting the riser back in place, my son filming, and that all went really well. It's important to keep in mind, folks, that these events as they happen now, it's become commonplace to just blame it on climate change. Hashtag climate change. Of course, the climate's always shifting, but to chalk this whole thing up to climate change is really not only reductionist, it's really disempowering. I mean, basically all of the problems from this storm came from human choices to build stuff in the floodplain, to put roads and settlements and other infrastructure in the places that we all know flood regularly. So it's not really a natural disaster, it's a human design error, which could basically all be avoided. So the climate change piece is kind of neither here nor there in a lot of ways. Like, yeah, the climate's always shifting. Are we playing a role in climate change? Probably. That's irrelevant to this particular event, in that we could avoid these problems simply by not building as much as we do in places we know have always flooded and will always flood, no matter what we do about quote unquote climate change. This visual is just one town in Vermont. I happen to be reading the town history book the last few weeks, Lincoln, Vermont, and some of the major crazy weather events that they've had over the years. If you look at any history books, you see these intense weather patterns, like all the time. Are they happening more now? In some places, sure. In some places, less. I mean, the climate's always been doing crazy stuff. It's nothing new. Floods are nothing new, to New England. They've happened often throughout our history. And I think one of the big problems with just chalking these things up to climate change is that not only is disempowering, because we can deal with climate change only to some extent with dubious outcomes, because a lot of climate change is totally natural. Whereas we can choose to build not in floodplains and make more adaptive societies with incredibly reliable results. I mean, we can just change the way we do things. And it's a win-win for everyone. Some of it's a big investment up front, big changes in decision making, but we can grow all our food in the hills. We can grow all our food not using floodplains, for instance. Certainly not put a lot of infrastructure related to farming that we do down there. But the other thing is, we also miss all of the benefits of an event like this. Like, this storm was incredibly beneficial for New England. It delivered, as we can see in this slide, that's 8 trillion gallons of water, I calculated, if we averaged it to 4 inches of rain for every acre, about 6 million acres in Vermont. That's a massive amount of water in a place that's been experiencing drought on and off for 4 years. We've been getting drier, contrary to the climate models, which say we are supposed to be getting wetter. So that's a great thing. And that actually is about 4.5 million pounds of nitrogen if you use the average of 0.5 milligrams per liter of nitrate, soluble nitrogen, which is plant fertilizer. Huge value. I mean, this improved our farm incredibly. This is now, the best hydration event we've had in at least 6 to 10 years. And even if it stopped raining the rest of the summer, our storages are full. Our pastures soaked up the water with our swale systems and our grazing and our tree systems. And we are not going to be arid for the rest of the season, most likely, even if it were to stop raining, which is unlikely. Huge buffer. I mean, it's changing our trajectory in terms of, like, hydrologically towards a more resilient way for multiple years. So this was a great event, really, like, for everything but humans doing stuff in the floodplains.
Can you get that Monarda for me over there?
Where is it?
Right there. Look, right there.
5 feet deep. Storages that are usually only full coming out of winter are completely full. Gives me ideas for new storages, bigger storages. When it's this wet, it's become instinct to plan for drought, and as it should be, because it's how things go. It's easy to be normed
you know, into whatever the current condition is. And it's easy to have the instinct, or have the inclination, okay, now I don't need to plan for those other storages. I don't need to plan for dry periods as I was, because there's an expense and an effort. But when it's this wet, we kind of need to, know in the back of our mind, well, it's going to be that dry. I mean, everything's like that, right? Equal and opposite reactions. But what a blessing up here, as long as you're not in the floodplain, to get this much water at the height of growing season. I mean, it's such a windfall. It's just so much value into the landscape. Plants are loving it. Storages are all full. We're just buffered against dryness now for months, really for the rest of this year, especially if you're set up well. Hope everyone's good. Very good learning event. Great insight. You can just see so much when we have a weather extreme like we just did.